Okay, hello, I am Jennifer Cobbe. I'm the coordinator of Cambridge University's Trust and Technology Initiative. I'm also a researcher and affiliated lecturer in the Department of Computer Science and Technology at Cambridge. I'm a member of the Microsoft Cloud Computing Research Centre, and I'm a member of the Law Committee of the IEEE's Global Initiative on the Ethics of Intelligent and Autonomous Systems. My background though was actually in law, via sort of human rights law and public law, but into technology law. I look at a variety of different things, mostly around what kind of legal frameworks do we need for new technologies in the future? What is the impact of new technology and new business models on society? And I taught myself to code as a teenager, so I also work with computer scientists to try to figure out how we can engineer systems in a better way to be more legally compliant, to be more accountable, and to try to minimise the kind of harms that we sometimes see with kind of irresponsible technology. So I'm going to give you today essentially 5 provocations about the ethics and governance of AI that will hopefully get you thinking about AI, about what it can and can't do, and about some of the ethical and regulatory challenges that we face when trying to deal with this kind of stuff. Okay, so my first provocation is that AI is really nothing new or really nothing special. Of course, we saw the photo of Arnold Schwarzenegger in Terminator and that kind of thing, and a lot of people tend to think of AI in terms of what we would call artificial general intelligence. But that's really not, of course, as I'm sure most of you know, what we're talking about. Even in public discourse, there's a lot of kind of magical thinking about what AI is actually capable of. And a lot of people selling AI will make huge claims about what it can and can't do that aren't really borne out by what the technology is capable of. Of course, what we're actually talking about is really usually machine learning, which, if anybody doesn't know, is the process by which a computer's statistical model is automatically trained using usually very large data sets to try to spot patterns and correlations in those data sets, and then infer information and make predictions based on those patterns and correlations. It's essentially just automated statistics. It's not actually particularly fancy, and it's not really particularly new. Of course, it isn't actually perfect, and it's not really particularly clever either. You would use machine learning when you're trying to find the sort of next best model that you can find by brute force, when the actual perfect model would be computationally intractable. So it's never going to be a perfect solution, and it's only ever going to be trained to within what people have decided to be an acceptable error of margin, or margin of error, sorry. So actually there are always going to be errors, there are always going to be flaws, and there are always going to be things that it can and can't do. It's only ever going to be an approximation of the best result. So machine learning is quite good, and really only quite good at 2 things. The first one is prediction, and the second is classification. So if you want to be able to look at past data to spot trends and predict what might happen in future, then machine learning can be quite useful for that. And if you want to try to figure out, based on past data, what kind of category or what kind of classification something should be placed into, then again, machine learning can be quite useful for that too. But if you want to do anything more than that, you might actually be asking too much of AI as it currently operates. Now, there's often an assumption with new technologies, including AI, that we're operating in a largely unregulated territory. There's always an assumption as well, I think, that law always lags behind technology. But I don't think either of these things are actually true. So, as my colleagues in Cambridge, Simon Deacon and Christopher Marco would say, technology's evolution is shaped by its legal environment. We already have laws and regulations that apply to AI. Indeed, the whole body of existing law applies to AI, of course. Sometimes it might not be clear how a particular law applies to a particular new technology, but most of the time, law applies pretty straightforwardly to these things without really having to have any kind of particularly clever interpretation or having to think too carefully about it. Data protection law, of course, as has been mentioned a couple of times, is extremely important here and will likely apply anytime you're making a decision about people or using their personal data. But also things like non-discrimination law. If you're using it in your hiring, then employment law will also apply, as well as, of course, a whole array of sector-specific laws and regulations that already apply to this kind of thing. And while advances in technology do tend to lead to advances in the law, we should also acknowledge that advances in the law lead to advances in technology. GDPR is actually a really good example. Many companies are now trying to find different ways of doing things that are more compatible, more compliant with what GDPR requires. And that's led to an array of new technologies that can broadly be called privacy-enhancing technologies. and new ways of doing AI and machine learning. But beyond GDPR, the need for AI systems to be legally compliant means that designers and engineers are often tasked with finding novel ways to do what the law needs. So my second provocation is that you probably don't need AI as much as you might think you do. It's often promoted, particularly by those who are developing and selling AI systems as a solution to all kinds of problems. But in reality, it might actually just cause more problems than it can possibly solve. This is part of a solutionist trend in new technology more generally, where technical solutions are often framed as being the best way to deal with socioeconomic or otherwise non-technical problems. But of course, in truth, socioeconomic problems and non-technical problems are rarely actually solved by technology. So I think there are three questions that you need to be asking yourself before you use AI. The first is, what kind of problem are we actually trying to solve? The second is the best solution to that problem actually a technical solution? And of course then the third is that if the best solution is a technical solution, is AI actually the best technical solution to that problem? But of course, even if AI is the correct solution to your problem, you do need to be thinking about the downsides, as has kind of been mentioned a few times today already. Machine learning systems are known to have problems with biases and with leading to discriminatory decisions. Not only do they encode the biases and assumptions of their designers, for example, in choosing which data data is considered and processed, which may disadvantage some groups, but also they rely on historical data, which may reflect society's biases generally, or perhaps the discriminatory practices of individual organisations specifically. And the Amazon hiring example is a really good example of that. But also, more fundamentally, machine learning works by classifying generally people into groups of shared characteristics and then drawing inferences or making predictions or making decisions about those people on the basis of those characteristics. And if in law they happen to be protected characteristics, then you run into a serious risk of making decisions which are discriminatory, which would open you up to a whole variety of really quite serious legal consequences. So when we talk about bias in machine learning, that's not really an abstract, intangible problem. It can lead to real concrete, real difficult issues. Machine learning also has many problems, as have been discussed already, with the lack of transparency and interpretability and accountability. These systems are often highly complex, difficult to understand, and even in some cases impossible to truly explain, even using the most up-to-date techniques for this kind of thing. If you're using AI within your organisation, then you really should be asking yourself whether you're comfortable relying on a system which probably can't tell you why it made a decision or why it reached a particular outcome. And while the real world is a messy, complicated thing, AI will inevitably flatten nuances and gloss over complexities. It relies on data that attempts to quantify a world that is often qualitative in nature and provides outputs that are overly simplistic sometimes, or even just downright misleading. In reality, the truth is that humans might actually be better at doing what you want AI to do. So my third provocation is that it actually makes no sense at all to talk about the ethics and governance of AI. I'm aware that this talk is titled The Ethics and Governance of AI, but there you go. The thing is that AI isn't really a single thing, and AI will differ depending on what you're using it to do, in what context you're using it, and on what the consequences are. So when people talk about AI or about regulating AI or about the ethics of AI, I immediately have a few questions. What type of AI? Being used by whom? To do what? In what context? And for what purpose? The answer to each of these questions will have a significant effect on any discussions around ethics or governance. But we can talk about some things that are actually still quite important. We can talk about, for example, responsible design, deployment, and use of AI systems. So this is a quote from Everyone, who are a think tank based here in London, who look at the intersection between technology and society. And they're a really good think tank, and I would very much recommend you go and read essentially everything they've ever published. But if you're considering using AI, then the onus is really on you to ask whether AI is the best solution to the problem that you're trying to solve, as I've already discussed. If you're developing AI, then the onus is on you to make sure that you use as broad and representative a training data set as possible. The onus is on you to test your systems rigorously, to audit them for bias. The onus is on you to minimise their error rate as far as possible. The onus is on you to provide mechanisms for decisions to be challenged and for errors to be addressed. If you're developing or deploying AI, then the onus is on you to ensure that you comply with all applicable laws, including data protection and non-discrimination law, and any sector-specific regulations that might also apply. The onus is on you to think and act responsibly about the consequences for your business, for your employees, for your customers, and for society more generally, even if that potentially costs your business money. Ultimately, if you're using AI in your business, then it is your obligation, both legally and morally, to do so responsibly, and to be prepared to decide that you're better sticking with humans. So my fourth provocation is that there's no such thing as ethical AI in an unethical business. It's long been understood by sociologists of technology that technologies could only be understood in their broader cultural, socioeconomic, political, legal and organisational contexts. Technology isn't neutral. It's always important to think about what you're doing with it and where it's being used. You need to think about the assumptions behind its design and development, the purposes for which it's being developed, deployed and used, and the goals and outcomes that it's intended to achieve. So if your business model isn't ethical, if your practices aren't ethical, if what you're doing with AI isn't ethical, then your AI cannot be ethical. Now, I know some of you, I won't name any names, might work for businesses that might be considered by some people to be at least ethically questionable. But introducing AI is actually an opportunity to assess your business, to think about your business practices more generally, and to address any unethical practices or behaviours that you might find in that business, to help make sure that what you're doing with AI is ethical, responsible and beneficial to wider society. Okay, so my fifth provocation is that we need and should welcome regulation of AI. I know I just said that we can't talk about regulation of AI as a thing, but bear with me. When it comes to addressing the challenges of AI, ethics just simply is not enough. And self-regulation usually leads sooner or later to regulatory failure. With only ethics, which are always going to be voluntary, unscrupulous companies might use the insights generated by irresponsible AI to gain market share without caring about the consequences for society more generally. With only self-regulation, companies who benefit from abusing AI would be left to watch over themselves. If we rely on the market to solve things, we risk the development of structural problems that allow unethical or irresponsible AI to run unchecked. And ultimately, without legal intervention, there's a real danger that irresponsible AI becomes the defining feature of AI in the public's imagination. This would allow scare stories to proliferate. It would make it much more difficult for well-meaning companies to prosper, and it would potentially lead AI to be viewed by the public similarly to another two-letter initialism, GM or genetically modified. We need enforceable regulation to promote responsible technology, to help ensure that the potential harms are minimised, and to increase the chances that AI's benefits are realised. People often claim that innovation would stifle regulation. Well, there's an extent to which that's the point. We need to think more critically about the idea that innovation is always a good thing, and accept that actually not all new ideas are good ideas. Even technologies which are beneficial in one context can be harmful or damaging in another. And as I said earlier, law and regulation often drives the development of technology in a societally better direction. But remember, regulation will, as I said, look different for AI in different areas, in different contexts, when being used for different purposes. But comprehensive regulation to set general rules for automated decision making, for example, would ensure a level playing field where businesses who care about responsible technology aren't disadvantaged, and would set a baseline that would protect individuals and society and would leave space for AI to be used for the better. So I'm going to leave you with one final thought. And this is that we must remember that as a society, we operate under the rule of law, not the rule of technology. The law must remain the reference point and what technology can and cannot do mustn't be allowed to become the standard by which we evaluate these things. If a technology can't do what the law requires, perhaps even if the technology can't do what ethics requires, then the answer is simple: don't use that technology. Thank you.
Who's got a question or comment on what Jennifer's just shared?
Johnson, I'm from Lloyds Banking Group. I think you were talking about sort of the responsibility of the AI that's been built. If we think of the automotive industry, which is something that's looking at self-driving cars, if it was in an accident, who would then be responsible for that particular accident? Is it the person human in the car? Is it the company who created the car? Or is it the people who did the AI?
So that's a really good question, thank you. The answer is that we don't really know yet. This is very much an ongoing discussion. My instinct would be that if you're a company who provides the model that's being used in these cars, then you would probably be responsible for that. If it's your model that's led to a crash. Of course, if it's been put into a car by a company who maybe hasn't implemented it properly, or hasn't used their sensors properly, or hasn't done their LiDAR properly, then arguably they could also be responsible. But we still don't really know to what extent different sort of stakeholders in that kind of area would be responsible. But there's a real serious risk, I think, if we don't address this sooner rather than later, of getting to a point where nobody's responsible, and that's really not a good thing, I don't think.
Hi, I'm Grant Miller from First Rates. Thank you for making this a good debate. There's some 5 really good provocative points to raise. I'm interested in your view on bad law. So we're all capable of producing bad law. How do we look at that in the context of your provocation?
Sure. So one of the reasons that actually law does tend to take some time when we decide we do need new law for new technologies is that you need to do it properly. You can't rush into regulating things. You can't rush into setting legal standards for things or legal requirements for things. You need to think about these things carefully. Of course, there are such things as bad laws. There are laws that we might think are unjust or unequal, or which create bad outcomes for individuals, for organisations, or of course for society more generally. And I think the simple answer for bad law is to try to get the law changed. Ultimately, if you're a business, then you're opening yourself up to significant risk if you decide that a law is bad and you're not going to deal with it anymore. That's probably not the way forward. But trying to get the law changed it's a slow process, but it's probably the correct process. But yeah, there is a reason why things take time sometimes, and that's to try to avoid bad law. But of course, no law is ever perfect because law is a human societal institution, and human institutions are never perfect.
Tony Hutchinson, Heathrow. Really interesting, really thought-provoking. My question is really prompted by the question about the automated vehicles. We have a history of making law when we need it, after the fact. There are a lot of issues we see coming that it would be really interesting to understand, do we have a forward plan of the regulations and the decisions we should make before they happen?
So I think that's a really interesting question. So one of the things that I would say with new technologies is that they tend to be driven primarily by incentives. So you've got your political incentives, you've got socioeconomic incentives, and you've got legal and regulatory incentives. And there might be some others as well, of course, there's business incentives and the profit motive, of course. But there's a really good example with Uber. Uber started as a company in San Francisco, which was undergoing a massive transformation in the late 2000s, early 2010s, as its population was rapidly expanding. And there was a limit in the number of taxi licenses that were available in San Francisco, and this was set by the San Francisco City Council. So people decided that because there was a limit on taxi numbers and because they needed a whole load of more taxis, instead of trying to get the law changed, they would just create an alternative taxi service using an app, and that became Uber. Now Uber is an interesting company because its business model depends on either one of 2 outcomes. It's either going to need fully autonomous vehicles to become the reality much, much sooner than they're probably going to happen, if they ever happen. It also then, if that doesn't work out, it needs then to essentially establish a monopoly. So what it does is it runs with billions and billions and billions of dollars of funding from venture capitalists, and it runs at a huge loss. So in the last quarter last year, it lost about $1.8 billion, which is a huge amount of money to lose in a quarter. But this allows it to massively undercut its competitors with the intention of forcing them out of business and establishing monopolies, and then of course raising its prices back up again. So what we have here is a company that's been shaped by socio-economic incentives that has itself gone on and created a whole lot of other problems potentially for markets, for society, for regulators, and for everything else. But actually, proactive government, proactive regulators would have never allowed Uber to exist in the first place, because if they were paying attention to the socio-economic factors going on in the world in which they inhabited, they would have increased the number of taxi licenses, and we wouldn't have had all these issues in the first place. So what we actually need is proactive regulation, proactive governance, and proactive thinking about how to deal with this. It's not straightforward, of course, but there are ways to do it. If you understand that the technology is driven by incentives, then your job is to align those incentives in such a way as to try to push that technology in a better direction. And I have a lot of conversations with regulators, with people in government. I was speaking in Parliament just the other day about essentially this very question of what do we do next about new technologies. And there is a willingness to think about essentially preemptive regulation in some sectors, to think about the problems that might come along and to see what we can do about those in advance. So I think we're beginning to see a change in how governments and regulators and politicians think about this kind of thing. And I think if that change really comes to its fruition, then we will see more proactive government. And I think that's probably a good thing for the kind of issues we're going to be dealing with.
My name is Simeon from GSK. I just wanted to ask you, because you just mentioned that you speak to a lot of regulators, can you think of an example of an industry or a technology where those regulators overlooking it have got it, quote unquote, right, as close as possible as they can to, I guess, doing the right thing in the interest of people? And can we learn anything from that regulator to apply to AI?
It's difficult to say that any regulator has got it right. There are some that have got it less wrong than others, which is probably more what we're kind of dealing with. I think when it comes to regulation, there's been a general assumption, I think, among regulators that they don't need to step in until problems are so bad that they don't have any other choice. We've seen that particularly with big tech over the last couple of years, or the last couple of decades, I suppose, where regulators have sort of had a very hands-off approach to dealing with a lot of the problems around privacy, around data protection, around surveillance kind of issues, along with all the things that we've seen developing on the internet, like disinformation and manipulation, and what the government is now euphemistically calling online harms. And I think generally when it comes to a lot of new technologies, regulators, generally speaking, have dropped the ball. But I think they realise this now. So for example, the ICO is creating a sandbox environment where people can come and test out new systems, try out new things, without judgment, without scorn, without really worrying about getting into trouble. They can try things and see if they work for their business, but also work in terms of compliance. And I think things like that are actually a really positive way forward. I think if more regulators did that kind of thing, and I think the FCA does a similar kind of thing, then I think we would be dealing with much better regulation, much more proactive regulation, and probably a better way forward.
Hi, I'm Esther from Oracle. I'm really interested in the fact that the AI is using historic data, and as society develops, our opinions and attitudes change, as well as the laws that we're working on. And I wondered how you think we can guard against unintended bias or even unrecognised bias that's going to come out in the use of AI.
So I think the fact that we use, obviously, historical data, because it has to be historical data, essentially, part of the problem is that the past is not the same as the future. And by using this historical data, we do run the risk of essentially encoding the past into the future. So what we actually need to be doing, I think, is testing systems, auditing data sets. We need processes, not just around the machine learning model itself, not just technical processes, but socio-technical processes within organisations much more broadly for checking these things, for making sure that the data you're dealing with reflects not just your practices, but society more generally, because of course, no organisation is perfect, and historically, your company might not have been, the best in some ways. And in fact, that's just the way many companies were in the past. And it's the same problem that you see right across many, many different sectors. So it's all about just being alive to these issues, knowing that these are problems, knowing that these are risks. And actually, one of the groups of people that I think we need to be speaking to a lot more about this stuff is social scientists, or people from social science backgrounds, who are much more aware, perhaps, of the different power dynamics in society, the different biases in society, the different axes of oppression within society. When it comes to this kind of stuff, there's an assumption that what you need are people who've studied STEM subjects, but we really need social scientists. We really need people from humanities backgrounds to come in and give those perspectives, because without them, we're just not going to be able to deal with this stuff properly.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Jennifer, thank you very much.
Thank you.